Please join me in welcoming Jessica Fern and David Cooley.
Thank you all. The perfect like curl up with a book weather. So appreciate you coming out on this sort of cool fall evening.
That's not popular.
Yeah. The fire trucks are here. That's right. So this book is really special to us, and it's so sweet to be here. We live in Asheville, just outside of Asheville and Candler, and this is our first book tour event for this book. And so please forgive us if we picked all the wrong passages to read because we haven't tested them out yet. We'll be reading about 4 different passages from the book. There will be time for questions at the end. And what do you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's really special to do this in Asheville, especially thinking about being at the heels of the 1-year anniversary of Helene. And so one of the things that I'm really feeling into with this is the community support, how that's something about this region that I really love, and the resilience that's part of that. We were writing this book through that storm. That's something that's indelibly imprinted in my nervous system with this process. So it's really kind of an extra layer of meaningful to do that here with you all tonight.
Yeah, I had to find like the one parking lot with some cell service so I can send the draft to the publisher. It's that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start with just reading the first few pages just to make sense of what are we even talking about here. So, okay. As I clicked end meeting on my screen, the familiar silence of my office settled in. The last video session of the day with a therapy client had just wrapped up. I exhaled, sinking into my chair, but despite the day winding down, I felt an internal tug of war revving up. My eyes jumped to the unread emails in my inbox. The diligent taskmaster in me urged me to tackle them now. But the mother part of me wanted nothing more than to check in with my son, to hear about his day. A glance at my phone revealed a cascade of notifications. My sister sending funny cat gifts, my mom needing input on family logistics, my partner leaving a voice memo, a friend reaching out with difficult news. The sister, daughter, partner, and friend in me all felt the pull to respond immediately. And yet there was another voice, one reminding me that before I turned outward again, I needed to pause and reconnect within. After a day of holding space for others, I longed to feel grounded, first in myself, then with my son, and texts could come after. As far as emails are concerned, I found myself wishing for an assistant or the ability to freeze time so I could tackle them without sacrificing my personal needs or family time, knowing they'd be better handled with fresh eyes in the morning. All of these competing needs reminded me how often I think of myself in terms of parts. By parts, I mean the different aspects of myself, each with its own concerns, priorities, and desires, creating the amalgam that is me. The concept of me as a whole person, Jessica, is made up of not one facet, but many. The nurturer who loves making breakfast for others, the professional seeking purpose, the dreamer lost in ideas, the lover desiring intimacy, the loyal friend, the quiet introvert, the inner child who still fears the dark, and a sassy teenager who is fiercely independent, just to name a few. At any given moment, I find myself asking, which part of me is speaking right now? Which part is feeling this emotion? Is it a protective part, a wounded part, a wise part? When I'm talking with a friend, which part of me is showing up? The part that wants to sound smart, the part that is genuinely seeking connection, or the part that is people-pleasing? The same goes for my relationship. What parts of my partner do I feel safe with, drawn to, or frustrated by? What parts of me support our relationship and which get in the way? If you're already familiar with the idea of having different inner parts, great, you're with me so far. For those of you new to this concept, you might not already think of yourself as having multiple inner parts per se, but you probably recognize having different sides to who you are. A serious side in some situations, a playful side in others, or a competitive side when the stakes are high. You might relate to feeling torn between going out or staying home, between one part that feels obliged to show up and another just wants to rest. Similarly, you might experience a conflict between one part that's committed to a healthy lifestyle and another that craves indulgence. I didn't always think this way. Like many people, I used to believe I had one true self, a single unified identity, something unchanging and stable at the core of who I was. Many of us are taught this from an early age. We hear phrases like be yourself or find your true self, as if there's one definitive version of us waiting to be uncovered. We're conditioned to think of ourselves as a singular I, and when we experience contradictions, one part of us wanting connection while another pulls away, one part craving risk while another prefers caution, we assume we're just indecisive or inconsistent, or there's something wrong with us. But what if this inner push and pull isn't a flaw, but a fundamental truth of how the mind works? What if these contradictions aren't mistakes to be corrected, but evidence of something essential, something natural? The idea that we are made up of multiple parts isn't new. Philosophers, psychologists, and people in various spiritual traditions have long explored the multiplicity of the human mind. Despite these perspectives, modern culture conditions us to believe in a singular self. We're taught to fit into neat categories, introvert or extrovert, thinker or feeler, organized or messy, a hugger or not. But if you've ever felt torn between responsibility and desire, logic and emotion, what you want and what you feel you should do, you've already encountered the truth that we are not as singular as we assume. This realization can be confusing because even when we recognize different aspects of ourselves, we're often taught to see them as a problem rather than as a natural part of being human. For example, hearing about parts may bring to mind narratives like that of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or film tropes about people with multiple personalities, which can reinforce fears that having different sides makes us unstable, disorganized, or dangerous. The underlying message is that if you don't feel entirely consistent all of the time, something must be wrong with you. While extreme fragmentation, such as dissociative identity disorder, which was previously known as multi-personality disorder, it does exist, and it's distressing. But it represents a very specific and uncommon experience in which parts become so separated that people may lose time or have no awareness of shifting from one part to another. For most people, however, even strong internal conflicts or shifts in mood happen with some degree of awareness and memory. Parts within our human psychology exist on a broad and relatable spectrum of intensity. Feeling reactive, torn, or overwhelmed by different internal voices is not a sign of pathology. It's a reflection of our complexity and a sign that there's more going on inside us than we've been taught to see. Having internal parts is not a disorder. It's a normal and intelligent aspect of being human. Our parts aren't a problem. They're a reflection of our depth, adaptability, and ability to function, love, create, and grow. That said, even within the normal range of human experience, some parts make life difficult. They may sabotage us, carry trauma, hold us back from opportunities, push away loved ones, get defensive, dwell in shame, or engage in self-destructive behaviors. Because many of these parts first formed when we were children or adolescents, they often continue to think and react with the level of emotional and cognitive development we had at that earlier time. In essence, they're trying to run our adult lives with a child's logic, which is why they're often overwhelmed, impulsive, or reactive, even when they have the best of intentions. If left unexamined, they can drive us towards actions we later regret, distort how we see ourselves, and create roadblocks in our relationships. The key isn't to fear or reject them, but to develop a new kind of relationship with them. This book is about change, real and lasting change. It is a guide for loving the parts of yourself that may seem the most unlovable and overwhelming, and transforming them into allies instead of enemies. More specifically, this book explores the three particular parts I believe create the greatest barriers to psychological and spiritual health. I call them the shame triangle, an internalized version of the drama triangle, which is later in the book. These three parts are the inner critic, the voice in our head that judges, belittles, and finds fault, holding us to impossible standards or telling us we're never enough. Shame, the part that feels like something is fundamentally wrong or broken inside you. It says if people really saw you, they'd turn away. It makes you shrink, hide, and silence yourself to avoid the risk of rejection. The escaper, the part or parts of us that cope with self-criticism and shame by numbing, avoiding, or distracting through overworking, overperforming, withdrawing, or other forms of escapism. Together, these parts create a cycle of self-judgment, shame, and avoidance, one that can quite literally take over our entire lives. They shape the way we see ourselves, dictate the risks we take, and dreams we abandon, and limit the love and connection we allow ourselves to give and receive. This inner triangle erodes our confidence, fuels self-sabotage, and convinces us we are fundamentally unworthy. It keeps us stuck, disconnected, and unable to fully engage with the life we long for. I wish I could say I was exaggerating, but I'm not. But that cycle doesn't have to define us. These parts, as overwhelming as they might be, are not who we are at our core. Just as these parts hold us back, they also hold the key to our transformation. And when we learn how to work with them, rather than being controlled by them, we open the door to something far greater: freedom, real lasting freedom to live, love, and express ourselves without the weight of constant self-judgment and fear. Parts work help unify these different aspects of our inner world by building a conscious, supportive relationship between them. It allows us to acknowledge their needs, address their fears, update their beliefs, and guide them toward healthier roles. Through this process of working with our many parts, we can develop a clearer, stronger sense of self. In the pages ahead, we'll begin this journey, not by fighting our parts, but by using parts work to understand them, transform them, and step into a new way of being.
Give me this reading voice.
Thank you.
So we want to give you all just a little taste of kind of what we're thinking is sort of where often the shame triangle begins for people internally. You can start with the shame work, really with any of the parts that she just mentioned, right? We have the inner critic, shame itself, and then the escapers. But we really find that the cycle starts with the inner critic. And so that's where we're going to start right now. So I'm going to read a little passage from the book, just talking about one of my inner critic parts, so we can get a sense of what that sounds and feels like and contextualize it a little bit more. So this is from the chapter called Getting to Know Your Shame Triangle. This is where I start to reckon with the beginning of old age and the fact that I probably need glasses. I can vividly remember the origin of one of my most active and crippling inner critic voices. It took root in my sophomore year of high school in the fluorescent lit classroom of Mr. Galloway, my English teacher. He believed in rigor and discipline and the ruthless sharpening of thought until all excess sentimentality was stripped away. I, on the other hand, wrote with feeling. following the currents of emotion rather than the rigid scaffolding of formal argumentation. The difference between us was a constant point of contention. Ostensibly, his critiques were preparing me for the expectations of university professors and, by extension, the real world. But I experienced them as a relentlessly demanding dismantling of something deeply personal. Day after day, I sat in his class with a sinking feeling in my gut, dreading the moment my papers would be returned. Poured myself into them, writing with raw emotion, letting my thoughts spill out onto the page in a way that felt natural and unfiltered. But when Mr. Galloway handed them back, I cringed at the sight of his red ink slashing through my words like a crime scene. Too sentimental, lacks discipline, no clear argument. To drive the point home, he would often address the class with remarks like, "Some of you still write as if this is a personal journal. That won't cut it out there in the real world." The sting of his disapproval burrowed deep in me. I had always been a sensitive kid, feeling my way through language rather than structuring it like a blueprint. But Mr. Galloway's critique went well beyond my grammar and organization. I internalized them like an indictment of the way my mind worked, the way I expressed myself. Each time I turned in an assignment, I braced myself for his disappointment. Little by little, I began to edit myself before my pen even touched the page. I learned to write how he wanted, detached, structured, intellectual, trading my natural voice for the safety of approval. Over the years, I perfected the art of sounding competent and controlled. Yet as an adult, I've often been told that my writing feels too disembodied, dry, and overly intellectual. The irony is painful. That severance, the one that began in Mr. Galloway's classroom, has followed me ever since. I internalized his voice as my own, an inner critic that flares up whenever I try or dare to write from the heart. Jessica has seen this firsthand in our work together. When she asked me to write stories, to tap into the same warmth and emotion that comes so easily when I speak, I struggle. The inner critic hijacks the process, steering me towards analytical detachment instead. Yet outside of serious writing, I have no trouble expressing feeling, whether in heartfelt card to a friend or in conversation where stories flow effortlessly. It's only when writing takes on an official public form that the critic takes over, demanding that I strip away what makes my voice my own. That's the legacy of Mr. Galloway. It illustrates how an inner critic doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's shaped by the voices we absorb, the expectations we try to meet, and the parts of ourselves we learn to hide in order to belong. Over time, what starts as external critique becomes an internal law, dictating not just how we express ourselves, but who we believe we're allowed to be.
Wow. Thank you. Love that story. Not that it happened, but. So in the book, we go through working with the inner critic, with your shame, and with the different ways that we escape. And we have a chapter that talks about shame triangle triggers, right? How it comes from places in the world, experiences we've gone through, injustices in the world, power struggles and structures in the world. And it's obvious, like in Dave's case, when a teacher is criticizing him, that it would get internalized as an inner critic. But we also see that the shame triangle shows up when things are going well. And that can be quite confusing or paradoxical. We feel good and then we feel shame about it. Right? We feel pleasure and we were taught that wasn't okay, right? And we shouldn't feel it. So this is a story that I share in the book about a time when it's called the trouble with positive events. So this is precisely what happened to me during an important moment in my late 20s. I was in a 2-year socially engaged Buddhism program, and at our last in-person retreat, participants were invited to lead mini workshops to share our unique expertise with our peers. I decided to teach a class on the drama triangle. By all external measures, my workshop went really well. My peers gave positive feedback, people engaged with the exercises, and shared that the workshop was insightful and beneficial for them. Objectively, I had every reason to feel good about it. But despite this success, as the day continued, I found myself slipping into an unexpected shame triangle spiral. While attending my peers' workshops afterward, I found it nearly impossible to stay present. My inner critic had already started picking apart my performance, questioning my clarity, tone, and delivery. At the same time, shame had me scanning the room, trying to gauge whether people were more engaged in these sessions than in mine. Had I been clear and compelling enough? Did I measure up to other presenters? Were people genuinely interested in what I had shared, or were they just being nice? Instead of being fully present and supporting my peers during their presentations, I was trapped in my own nightmare of self-doubt and comparison. Each time I caught myself drifting into a shame triangle story, I attempt to refocus on the presentation at hand, only to further berate myself for being so self-absorbed. By the time all the workshops were over and the entire group reconvened in the meditation hall, my inner critic had reached full volume. That was a disaster. You made such a fool of yourself. Shame's resulting embarrassment, the urge to disappear was so overwhelming. It became physical. I was dizzy and nauseous. My body felt heavy, as if gravity had intensified just for me. I couldn't sit up like everyone else. I needed to lie down. Fortunately, the setting allowed for some camouflage in that lying down with meditation cushions wasn't completely out of place, which enabled me to feign engagement in a lying down meditation to mask my turmoil. To further maintain appearances, my escaper fabricated an excuse to those immediately around me about spontaneous back pain, saying it required me to do the meditation lying down, all while I was actually immobilized by an internal war zone, effectively playing dead to the world around me. But the worst part wasn't just how harsh my inner critic had become. It was where it eventually aimed. Instead of stopping at my performance, it attacked my deepest sense of purpose. You're not meant to do this. You don't have what it takes to help people. You should abandon this path before you embarrass yourself further. My inner critic went for the jugular with this one, targeting what was most precious to me, my sense of purpose to be a positive support in this world, hammering me with the idea that I lacked what it really takes to make a difference in life. The weight of these words pressed down so hard that even standing felt impossible. As I lay there stuck, my escaper scrambled for exits. Should I leave the retreat? Fake a family emergency? Escape to my dorm room? But every escape route felt like another failure, further proof of me being a loser. What was happening to my body was so intense, I thought I must be coming down with something, but that something was a shame triangle sickness, not an actual cold. Despite my efforts to appear unaffected, one of the lead teachers sensed my distress and came over to check in on me during a break. I cautiously admitted that I felt horrible despite knowing my presentation had gone well. He kindly suggested that what I was experiencing might be likened to the swing of a pendulum, where my bold step to lead a discussion, especially among older, seasoned speakers, had been an expansion beyond my comfort zone. So naturally, a contraction followed. He believed that this act of stretching myself led to an opposite contraction and inward recoil, and my embarrassment wasn't proof of failure, but rather the aftershock of growth. I appreciated this perspective. His words helped, and even though they didn't erase the shame triangle knockdown I was in, they gave me more context. Even with his insights, I remained altered for the rest of the day. I felt hungover from this experience, exhausted, foggy, drained. It took time for my body and mind to recover from the sheer force of the shame triangle impacting me this severely. This wasn't the worst shame triangle takedown I'd ever experienced, nor was it the last. But it was the first time I fully grasped how something positive could detonate an extreme shame triangle episode. No actual failure or humiliation had occurred. In reality, I had succeeded. Yet internally, it felt as if I had been booed off the stage and ejected from the temple. The contrast between my internal lived experience and objective reality was staggering and frankly dangerous. What if I hadn't been able to wake up from that nightmare? What if I had taken it as truth and walked away from something I was meant to do? The experience made one thing crystal clear. The shame triangle isn't just a crappy voice in our head or a painful feeling. It can hijack the entire system, including the body, leaving us physically incapacitated, and it can do so even when things go right.
So there's something about that we want to highlight in this moment, and it's really not just the kind of insidious nature of the way that the shame triangle functions within us, but how complex it is, and then also how overwhelming that feature of overwhelm, which is really has a somatic component to it. It's not just an intellectual or emotional experience, it's literally a physical one. One of the reasons why we're writing this book is because we're really wanting people to understand and have a clear sense of this complexity and how problematic this can be for us. And there's a lot of different areas in our life relationally, even with ourselves, where this gets in the way of really being the kind of people we want to be. So one of the features of internal family systems work has already been talked about in the intro, right? Which is the parts of us. The other side of that coin is self. This is the place within us that's really unfazed, untouched, undestroyed, unlost because of the reactivity of our parts. And this is really the starting point of any of the internal work that we're wanting to do when working with the shame triangle. We're really wanting to understand first, what is self? When we say that, what does that mean? Then how do we differentiate it between self and parts? And then what are the ways that we can utilize that, right, differentiation in the work? Because constantly in the work with this, we're seeing people get lost. Right? In a moment you can be fine, and then all of a sudden something happens, a trigger, and you're a different person. You're in a different consciousness, literally, right? Your nervous system is changed fundamentally, and your perception becomes distorted. So we're really wanting people to understand, what does self feel like versus a part or parts, and how do you access that consistently? So the next section that I'm going to read is really getting us acquainted with the self. And we have 2 chapters because it feels so important. We've dedicated 2 chapters to self, because we really want people to understand the true dimensions of it as much as possible. We've already emphasized that self is the foundation of parts work. Without self-energy, we risk engaging with our parts from a place of urgency, frustration, or reactivity rather than curiosity and compassion. Many clients say, I've done so much work on this issue already, or I've tried everything with this part. But when we pause and examine who is truly leading the process, we often discover it's not the self, it's another part. And no matter how well-intentioned, when parts try to lead, the work stalls. This distinction is pivotal. Without self-energy, the shame triangle becomes a maze. We try to find our way out, only to keep hitting dead ends. With self-energy, we can finally step out of that maze. It creates the space to unblend from these parts, witness them without being overtaken, and engage with them from a place of understanding rather than resistance. The challenge is that the shame triangle makes it difficult to access self, yet only self can transform it. When we are fully caught in inside it, our perspective is limited to the parts driving it. We become so blended with them that their pain, fear, and judgments feel like absolute reality. When self is present, we gain enough space to see these parts for what they truly are, wounds and protective strategies, rather than our core identity. From this place, real transformation becomes possible. The self in IFS, internal family systems. According to the IFS model, we all have different parts that help us navigate life. Manager parts keep us moving, handling responsibilities, showing up for work, and maintaining our daily routines. Other parts carry pain, the weight of past experiences, or the scars of marginalization and injustice. Then there are protectors, the parts that step in to shield us from feeling too much, too fast. They work to keep us safe, to prevent us from looking bad, losing connection, or jeopardizing our place in the groups we belong to. Their strategies, whether perfectionism, people-pleasing, or staying small, are meant to protect us from what we fear the most. But sometimes their efforts become so rigid that they block growth rather than support it. And over time, we can start to mistake their voices for the whole truth about who we are. At the core of IFS is the concept of self, or self-energy, our true, unshakable essence, existing beyond the fears, wounds, and agendas of our parts. The discovery of self was a turning point in the development of IFS. Richard Schwartz, the founder of this system, first encountered self in his clinical work. As he helped clients work with their parts, he noticed a pattern. When protective parts were asked to step back, something unexpected emerged. Clients described a presence that was calm, clear, and unlike any of their usual internal voices. It wasn't another part with its own agenda, it was something deeper. When Schwartz asked clients to name what they were experiencing, they struggled to put it into words, simply calling it me. This presence was distinct from their pain and trauma, yet capable of holding and healing their wounded parts with a natural, effortless compassion. Even those with severe trauma histories had access to it, revealing that self-energy was not something earned or developed. It was an innate aspect of being human. This realization shaped the IFS model. Schwartz saw that no matter what someone had been through, their self remained intact. It could be obscured, but never destroyed. When someone struggled to access their self, it wasn't because they lacked it, but because their protective parts were blocking it, often out of fear that being in self would make them vulnerable. Over time, Schwartz found that helping clients build trust with these protectors allowed self to emerge more fully, creating the conditions for lasting healing. To help people recognize when they're in self, Schwartz identified 8 qualities that naturally emerge in self-energy: compassion, curiosity, calm, confidence, courage, clarity, connectedness, and creativity. These qualities, often referred to as the 8 C's of self, serve as signposts, helping us distinguish where we are in self, whether we are in self or apart. These qualities are not skills to develop or traits we must earn. They are inherent aspects of self. However, certain parts can block access to them. For example, a hypervigilant part that expects danger makes it difficult to feel calm. A people-pleasing part may hold back curiosity, fearing that asking the wrong question could create a problem. A perfectionist part might override creativity, insisting that only flawless work is acceptable. But these blocks aren't barriers we should push through. They are invitations. Rather than forcing access to the 8 C's, we cultivate them by building trust with all of our parts. As we listen to and work with them, we naturally create more space for self-energy to emerge. While trauma, mental health challenges, and brain injuries can make it more difficult to access self, our self-energy is always present. For some, the journey to embody it is slow, requiring patience and practice, especially if we were never taught to recognize it. At first, self-energy may feel unfamiliar or elusive, but as we learn to access it, we realize we are supported by an incredible resource within ourselves. This discovery can be both challenging and empowering. It requires unlearning old patterns, and it reveals that a healing, stabilizing presence is already within us. No matter where we come from or what we've been through, everyone has access to self-energy and can learn to embody it. For those with spiritual or religious perspectives, the experience of self may already be familiar under different names, such as Buddha nature, Atman, eternal oneness, Christ consciousness, or the divine spark. Across spiritual traditions, there is a reoccurring recognition of an inner essence that transcends the ego, connects us to something greater, whether it is seen as enlightenment, unity with the divine, or the fundamental nature of reality. While IFS offers one way to connect with self-energy, spiritual traditions provide another doorway, reinforcing the idea that this inner essence is not only real, but universally accessible. And it is acceptable. This is the last piece that I'll read from this. This is called self-leadership. The primary goal of IFS is to cultivate what we're calling self-leadership, where our self-energy becomes the guiding force in our lives, rather than letting our various inner parts lead the way. Ideally, the self sits confidently in the driver's seat of our internal system, with our parts riding along as passengers. Helpful companions, but not the ones at the wheel. Yet for many of us, the opposite often happens. Our wounded or protective parts take control while self is pushed to the back seat, or worse, locked away in the trunk, barely present at all. When these parts are in charge, we blend with their perspectives, losing sight of the fact that each part represents only a fragment of our experience, not the full picture. Self-leadership, in contrast, allows the self to hold a panoramic view that no single part can offer. The self can empathize with the truths and struggles of each part, while also transcending their limiting beliefs and judgments. This broad perspective gives us access to clarity, wisdom, and flexibility, helping us better navigate both our inner and outer worlds.
What time is it? Great. Let's read one more page to give you a sample. This will be quick of just where this goes. So after people are really rooted in this, in self-leadership, then they're walked through in several chapters how to dialogue with these shame triangle parts, how to also unburden legacy burdens. So a lot of the shame triangle is internalized from the world around us and from our direct experiences, but sometimes it is also inherited. It's one of my favorite chapters. But just to give you a sense of how we're thinking of this shift. So the shift from shame triangle to self-love triangle. Once we are centered in self and leading from it, the shame triangle no longer operates as a system of blame, fear, and escape. Instead, its parts shift into their highest expressions, creating a new internal dynamic. The inner critic becomes the inner coach, a voice that still holds us to healthy standards, but does so with encouragement rather than punishment. Instead of attacking, it supports. Instead of tearing down, it builds up. Shame transforms into raw experience, our capacity to fully feel what is, no longer weighed down by the oppressive belief that we are broken or unworthy. We reclaim the ability to experience all emotions as they arise, without resistance, escape, or self-judgment. The escapers evolve into the inner nurturer, no longer numbing or avoiding, but actively turning toward our discomfort with care and genuine self-support. The term self-love triangle is an intentional play on words. Instead of a love triangle's chaotic, conflicted dynamic, this is an integrated inner system of presence, curiosity, acceptance, and care. Often what literature or pop culture refers to as a love triangle is more about possessiveness, obsession, and lust than actual love. Here we are deliberately reimagining the concept, not as a tumultuous romantic scenario, but as an integrated inner system grounded in self-energy, a triangle of loving relationships between oneself and our different parts. The self-love triangle is an internal state of self-leadership, where all parts are welcomed into their preferred expression. Where shame and blame once ruled, love now leads. This transformation is both a destination and a lifelong process. The journey of the shame triangle to the self-love triangle is about reclaiming ourselves, not by eliminating or silencing our inner voices, but by helping them evolve. Each part is invited to shed its constricting role and instead embody the love, wisdom, and presence that has always been at our core. I'm excited for you to experience this shift firsthand.
Okay.
We have time for questions. Any questions? There will be some online too. Yes.
What are some simple practices that you use to try to stay aware of when parts are taking a little bit showing up? Something that you can be aware of throughout the day.
Yeah, there's a lot in the book that we offer, but one model that I really like is learning how to track the activity of parts so that we start to recognize them as they get activated in our system. So there's 3 different centers in our being that we're using in this book as a model that we're calling the self-centered model. And so we're talking about the mind, the heart, and the body. And so we're really wanting people to understand the way that parts show up in these different centers. Right? If we're talking about the mind, we're really wanting to pay attention to the stories and beliefs. Right? And so usually parts have extreme stories that follow certain kinds of logic. And when we're regulated and grounded in self, we can sort of see the way that those are faulty logics, like black and white thinking, right? Using superlatives. I'm always, I never, right?
You're never.
You're never.
You're always, Dave.
Right. Another way that they think or manifest is sort of the expert, or sort of, I know what's true, right? Which slips into sort of a fixed mindset reality. This is just how things are. This is reality. This is just what is. It can't be changed. It's sort of a shutting down of possibilities. There's also usually an adversarial tone, right? There's sort of an animation that's happening against either another part of self or self itself or someone else, right? Making whatever's happening a problem. So there's this adversarial tone that really infuses parts' ways of thinking, of communicating with self. From the heart's perspective, can really see parts active when we feel a disconnection from our needs and wants, right? When we feel like we can't really figure out what is it that's true for me, and there's some kind of disconnect around knowing what's happening in our relational experience, either with ourselves or someone else, or we feel flooded, right? There's this sort of this overwhelm of feeling, and feeling doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel manageable. And in the body, as we mentioned before, there's really that component of regulation, right? Are we actually regulating our nervous systems? Are we going into a fight or flight response, or kind of crashing, collapsing into more of a dorsal response, right? So these are different ways that we can start to notice and track the activity of our parts. That's really helpful for a lot of people.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Do we have like an infinite number of parts, would you say, or is it like, do we all have kind of a set of the same parts, or do you, like, as you do the work, do you begin to have like a working list of your own personal parts that grows or changes?
I love this question. Kind of all of the above, right? I mean, these are what we were seeing is everyone we're encountering has these 3 parts. The escapers actually usually we have several, and they have different ways of expressing that we get into much more detail. So it's like these are parts we're seeing consistently. What I do see is most people tend to have their like cast of parts. But I've had the experience where a new part emerges as an adult, because things happen as an adult, you know? Or I'm working through new content in my adult life and I'm like, oh, that's a 3-year-old part. I never encountered her before. How interesting. So it can feel like, oh yeah, there's some I really know, they keep recurring. It's, you know, the lead characters, and then there can be a lot of like new, surprising, supportive ones that show up. Yeah. Yeah.
We touched on this a little bit on one of your earlier sections, but you've both written a couple of books now at this point, which can be a very vulnerable endeavor. So how have you kind of had to tackle the shame triangle in your process of writing?
Ooh, go for the jugular. That's the kind of question I like. Juicy. Writing, you know, especially thinking about my story with the inner critic, writing can often be an excruciating process for me. Same thing with recording video. There's just so many inner critic voices that start to emerge. I'm not doing it right. Right. Or that sort of that feeling of where is my connection to my own heart center? Like this goes back to what I was saying to you, right? If I'm thinking about where parts show up, I start to lose access because of inner critic to this more vulnerable, sort of interpersonal, softer voice. And I start going into the mind to protect myself from the pain of the shame that comes up, right? So it's a real kind of reckoning, this process. And it's such an amazing opportunity to really be with these parts in a way that it's kind of, we're forced to put our money where our mouth is, right? If we're recommending that people are going to do this work, we have to do it too. We have to know how to do it. And for me, the writing of the book and the other book as well, has really done that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're applying it to ourselves all the time. And like every round of feedback from the editors, you know, it's just like, my shame triangle. It's painful, but you know, I think as this is my 3rd book, and each one I'm trying to write more and more from self. Yeah, and then maybe there'll just be no books.
Yeah, sometimes I notice parts can take over at inappropriate times, and I'm wondering like how you handle that without burying it. How do you remain present with those parts and still work on them in the right time?
I can answer that.
If you want, if you feel.
Yeah, I think of it as internal boundaries, like healthy internal boundaries is like parenting those parts. So there are certain moments where I know I'm going into something and I'm like, yeah, these certain parts can't be here, so to speak. So I'll let them know, like, hey, I'm doing this thing and you don't have to come, or I actually need you to stay back. And I need these other parts to be in the driver's seat. So just sort of talking to them ahead of time and letting them know, like, this is how I want my system to be, and telling them why. Parts then respond.
Yeah, follow-up question. Shame is like very aggressive with boundaries.
Yeah.
I find, so when, I think I can do that with some parts, but shame itself is one that it's like, nope, I'm gonna take over, I'm gonna make you lay down on the floor and ignore everything.
Yeah, one of the primary features of shame is the stories that it tells. Right, it uses the act of storytelling, the capacity that we have innately as humans to tell stories, and we believe those stories. Right, that's when we fuse with the shame part. The story is essentially of our own lovability, our own inherent faultiness, right? And so when we're lost in the story, we start to really get dysregulated in the nervous system. My existence is a problem. And so one of the things that happens with shame is when we're sort of blended with the stories, we literally don't feel safe. It feels like we're under threat, as if we were in the midst of an existential threat. That dysregulation, I think, is part of what makes it so hard to manage, is because physically we don't feel okay. So it confirms sort of the thesis or the hypothesis of the story of shame. So one of the things that I've really found helpful, especially for myself and with clients, is to first recognize that dysregulation. Get really familiar with your own kind of scale of 1 to 10. what does a 2 feel like of being activated? That's the lower end where we feel relatively regulated, all the way up to a 10. Do you have a sense of that scale? Most people that I encounter and start to quiz them on this or sort of pose this model really don't start registering their own dysregulation until they're up in the higher register when it's too late. And so what we're really wanting to be able to do is track that slow progression and then have a way of starting to calm the nervous system. So often I won't push against the story of shame itself and try to say, reason with it. Oh no, but that's not true. No, I am a good person. Oh, please, right? Almost like arguing with a drunk person or a tantruming child. They're not going to hear the reason. So we learn not to push against the logic of a shame story. We focus on regulation. I'm safe. I'm okay. Deep breath. How am I feeling in my body? Do I actually have any sense of real existential threat? So this is a way to sort of bypass that story and feeling locked or trapped in the story itself. Yeah.
What if you feel like you really are in your true self, but you recognize that the environment that you're in is a total conflict?
Yeah, then self has clarity, self has courage. So we can be in self and say, oh, this is not a good environment for me. And then we can act accordingly. And it's not, there's not all this inner, but this, what I should yield this way, and oh, but I should be okay that way. And
Or it's my fault
or
that
it's
these
my
things are
fault,
happening.
or let me blame them. You know, a lot of that just falls away. And there's just the clarity of knowing, you know, I know that if I eat certain foods, I'm going to be sick. That's just clear. There's no argument, right? You know that example well. Yeah.
How does this self fight back against this morality? There's shame on an existential scale right now. Like these people are bad, those people are bad. There's a lot of shaming
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
How does this help you be above that?
Well, for us, I think I would have to reframe some of that question, right? There's some pieces of it that I would want to change to make it fit with this sort of how we approach it. So we don't try to get above it and we don't try to get beyond it. We're really wanting to hold a space for it. Shame has no agenda. There is no real right and wrong in terms of the experience of self. It's just awareness. It's just a witness of what's happening. So it can see suffering and recognize suffering without making a judgment about sort of who's right, who's wrong. There's suffering happening. So you're really creating a space internally where you're not attached to, again, the stories of what's happening. And you're really more with the experience. This is painful. This is painful. This is happening. It's painful to see a country divided. It's painful to see people, right, tearing each other apart over ideologies, right, and belief systems. My need is for harmony and wholeness. I'm able to connect to those things through self. I'm able to stay regulated, right, by recognizing, yeah, this is not what I want. This is not ideal, but I'm not internalizing this as I'm responsible for it, or there's something wrong with me because it's happening. So it's really about how do we relate to something that's happening that's difficult without identifying or putting labels on top of ourselves because of the experience.
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you.
We have a question from online.
Yeah, we have a couple questions from online. The first one is, once you've done the work and are now able to work with all of the parts that have come forward, can you then choose to put some parts to rest?
Yeah.
Or do all these parts stay with you forever?
Great question. So yes, some of these parts retire. And we literally have that conversation with them. Like, okay, are you done doing this job that you don't have to do anymore? You've been doing this role since you were 5, you actually can retire. And so some parts will sort of dissolve and retire and kind of go away. The point is not to try to get them to go away though. Or parts take on new roles that are more relevant to me now. Like, what does protection at 45 mean, right? Or what is my professional self now? What need to be like? Yeah.
And then one other question was, when in the escaper part, how do you know you were in that part and not in true self? Sometimes you seem to be positive, exercise, job, achievement, or tuning others? When do they tip into shame?
I love that question because there's a nuance, an important nuance there. So one of the ways to recognize parts versus self is to sort of ask yourself, what is the role of this experience, right? This inner voice. And parts are really focused on doing. What is it that I need to be doing? Right. And so usually escapers are trying to do something to help us not feel the pain of being caught between shame and inner critic. So the inner critic flares inside of us, starts with this indictment of how we're fucking up. Shame believes it. And then the escaper is like, I don't want to be in this. I don't want to feel this way about myself. And so it generates these strategies. And so perfectionism, right? This way of being so busy that you don't have to feel the pain or the burden of the shame, right? And the battle between shame and inner critic, right? Or you could numb out, right? I just want to binge all weekend and watch Netflix, right? Because this thing in the back of my mind is just driving me, grinding me down. Or we could start to project it outward, right? I don't want to feel it. Something or someone is making me feel bad about myself, so I'm going to let them have it. I'm going to make them responsible for it. Or we can go into even more extreme behaviors like self-harming, where we've internalized the narrative so deeply that we just want to get rid of ourselves, to not be, to not feel anything. In the case of distinguishing for this question, distinguishing between sort of the parts that take on strategies, it's usually the kind of that first category of escapers, right? It's the doing,
The overfunctioning, high
overfunctioning,
achieving.
high achieving, right? It's getting caught in some activity to not feel, right? Again, self has no agenda. It's not trying to make anything happen. It's just being. Self is in being, not doing. And so if you can feel any element of the doing that's sort of driving us away from something that feels to be uncomfortable underneath, it's a good indicator that we're probably being driven by a part. That's a good
One
question.
more question. Okay, great. One last question, anyone?
When you talked about GID and in those days that they were talking about that, they tried to integrate the self
Yeah.
and integrate all those parts. So you didn't recognize that, that there were the parts. And so can you talk just a little bit, do you know a little bit of how that transformed from that more, I don't know, directive kind of way to this inner work?
Yeah, I think you're talking about dissociative identity disorder, which is, more extreme mental illness that, clinical practitioner is going to be working with. And my understanding is they were trying to integrate the parts, but it didn't always work because the parts don't necessarily go away.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, I think, what you're getting at is that was the attempt and it wasn't very effective. And that this, like Dick Schwartz and what he was doing was much more effective of saying, we don't have to get rid of these parts. We actually have to love them and tend to them and unburden their wounds and their traumas. And like we just said, some might go away or some stay in our system, but in a healthier form.
Yeah, I think part of what the attempt to integrate those parts was founded on was, whether conscious or not on the part of practitioners, was there's sort of a pathology projected onto the parts. Like, this is a problem inherently. And they were operating under the model still that was prevalent, was we're supposed to be this coherent, singular self. And so the parts were seen as something fragmentary and problematic. So in that sense, it's really one, revolutionary to embrace a model of multiplicity and internal multiplicity. And then two, to not see that as a problem and change the inner approach to that, not as something to fix or get rid of, but to embrace. And this is sort of, I think, one of the most audacious goals of this book, which is to transform our inner voice. I mean, I think if we're honest with ourselves, so many of us are just living with a lot of intensity of just harsh, critical inner voices. And it's so much of what amplifies this, the suffering of human life, is that we're our own worst enemies often. And so the goal for me with this work is really, how do we change that in a fundamental and practical way, so the inner voice actually feels supportive, actually feels nurturing. Not like I'm trying to, oh, I love myself, I'm good. But like that, your default response internally is,
Actually changes.
no, you're doing, of course, this is a hard situation. Of course, you're overwhelmed right now. Look at everything that's happening. Commiserating, validating, understanding. Yeah, tell me more about what you're needing from me right now. I get it. Right. That's the way we want to respond to parts. So sort of a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And we'll be here to sign any books if anyone wants that.
Yeah, thank you to everyone online.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for everyone showing up virtually.
Yeah.